All right, we are going to show you how to create a box, a container that contains a bunch of cubes in it that we're going to shake that container with a BPM so that as the container is shaked, all the cubes inside kind of go with it. So the way to do this is we're going to first create our box. And so to do this, we're going to go to the entities here in the toolbox and create box. And this is the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create the bottom of our container. And I'm actually going to hold down Shift as I draw it, so it creates a nice kind of a equal-sided square, basically. And then when we raise it, I'm going to set it to about that height. We want to create. This is going to be the bottom of our cube. And then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create the walls of this container. Now we could make a copy of this and then rotate it 90 degrees and then make clones and then position them manually. But there's actually a faster way potentially to do this, and we're going to do this by creating a tube. So we're going to go to Entities, and then at the bottom we're going to click on Tube. And we're going to just click and drag from the center of this box until we reach about the edges of it. And then we have to do another click here to represent the inside of the tube, and then we're going to raise this. Now, obviously, we don't want it to be a tube. We want it to be a cube size. So we're going to double click that tube shape, and then we're going to set the subdivision to 4 here. When we do that, it becomes a nice 4-sided container. And then I'm just going to adjust the radiuses until it kind of lines up with the edges of the box that was originally created. We'll want to make sure we have some thickness to our radius, to our tube, to our box, so that there's no the boxes inside don't penetrate through. And lastly, I'm just going to keep tweaking this until it kind of lines up. There's some tricks here that we can do to get it to be perfectly aligned, but for the purposes of this, I'll just adjust these values here. All right, I think that's close enough. And then lastly, I'm gonna cap this off. Actually, before we cap it off, I'm gonna just peek inside here. And I'm going to, actually, let's cap it off first. So I'm going to take the bottom, I'm going to hold down Alt and Shift at the same time so it stays aligned. I'm just going to drag this up to kind of close off our box. And then lastly, I'm going to lasso all of these together, and then I'm going to hit Control D to fuse it into one single shape. So now it's a single box that's empty inside. Hit stop.
Show under the edit menu the fuses too.
And yeah, basically when we hit Control D, what we're basically doing is going Edit, Tool, Fuse is what we did. And what that does is it takes a bunch of different meshes and unites the rigid bodies and makes them behave as one. And that's what we want for this case. So the next thing we want to do is draw our constraints. So the next thing we're going to actually do is create our BPM control. So we're going to click on the live tools on our toolbox, and we're going to create our BPM controls. And then we're going to click in the space and then right click to exit drawing, and it creates those controls. And as we know from another lesson, those controls also create a BPM pulse that lives in our universe. So now we can take this and apply it to various properties, and they'll be synced to our BPM. Now, so the first way you might think of doing this is to go directly into this thing's transform, this container's transform, and just assign it directly to one of these transforms. The problem if we do that is it doesn't properly manipulate the object with the right physics. It basically forces the object's position to a particular location without necessarily factoring in momentum and all these other things that will give it the natural kind of shakiness. So to do this instead is we want to use constraints, physics constraints. And so what we're going to do is on the physics category here on our toolbox, we're going to click on physics. Then we're going to click on fixed constraints. And then we're just going to click on the surface of this rigid body. So I'm going to stick one over here, and I'm actually going to create 2. I'm going to stick one over here as well. We'll have one of them moving vertically and one of them moving sideways. So it'll shake it in 2 different dimensions across 2 different directions. So now what we can do is we can assign our pulse, our BPM pulse, to the transform of our constraint. And then the constraint, when it gets moved, it then properly, with proper springiness, will move our container that it's connected to. And so let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to take the BPM pulse. So I selected the first constraint, and I'm going to apply the BPM pulse by dragging and dropping it to the y-axis. So it's going to move it up and down this box. And I'm going to repeat the same thing by selecting the second constraint, but yet apply it to the z-axis. And that's going to move it across the z-axis, so kind of across. So if we hit play here, let's see what happens. We're going to have to set a BPM here. And voila, now we have this funny shake. Maybe what we'll do is we'll set the interval for the second constraint to be every other beat. So on that second constraint, I just viewed its properties by clicking on it here in the hierarchy, and I'm going to set it to 2, so it's every other beat. So it's more of a kind of a weird pendulum-y kind of thing. So there we go. So now the final bits is we want to make this material invisible so we don't see anything. And then we want to fill it with our cubes. So to make the material invisible, I'm just going to select it. And I'm going to select our container. I'm going to go to materials, and I'm just going to set the material 1 here, which is set the default material, to none, and that makes it invisible. And finally, I'm going to put some cubes in here, and I'm just going to literally draw them off to the side, or you can just draw them directly inside in this case because it's invisible. But it's easier if you draw them to the side and then move them in. So I'm just going to draw out the box here, and then I'm just going to move it in using this kind of side one. And then I'm going to hold down Alt and make some copies of these boxes. And then maybe I'll make some smaller ones as well. So these are kind of big. So I'm going to make some smaller ones. I'm going to move it inside. I'm going to hold down Alt to make some copies of these smaller ones. So now when we hit play and we get our BPM rate up, we get this cool kind of shaky cube look. Now if we go to present mode, which will hide all of our helpers, now we just have these kind of funny bouncing cubes that kind of bounce with our beat. So a few other things we could do is we can, for instance, we could create a light source here, a spotlight, and then maybe we'll shine it on these cubes here to create some interesting shadows. I'm going to crank up its area radius, make it nice and bright. And we could maybe project the texture. So the spotlight has a texture projection. I'm going to import a texture, and we can just project some random texture here. So that looks interesting. And maybe I'll make it go to nighttime here. Kind of interesting. And then I'm going to keep tweaking this color value. I'm going to set the black so we just see the texture kind of project in. And then I'm going to set up BPM. Maybe I'll set some fog. Kind of weird, but and then I'm going to go to present mode. And there we go, a BPM container that's moving our cubes in this kind of strange way. Another thing we can do is play around with gravity, for instance. So let's say we set our space gravity of our terrain space. We set the gravity to 0 so that they're not, and then they kind of get accelerated in every direction here, which is kind of neat. Maybe we'll get rid of this texture actually, and make our light white again. So there you go, a container.
Half speed in present? Or the divide by 2? Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of crazy. I don't love that.
Or if we turn off auto mode, we can just manually tap this out. And they hit the surface of this thing. If you hit it and they're not touching the surface, nothing really happens.
So that's... could you do a third axis, I guess? It would be the same process at this point.
It would be, yeah. So the only thing to be mindful of is now that we've removed the material, when we click to create a constraint on this, it's going to kind of go straight through it and place it on the ground, but that's fine. It doesn't actually matter. So I'm going to go ahead and go to Physics, Fix Constraint. I'm just going to click on the surface of this. You'll actually see that it places it way in the ground in the background. It actually doesn't matter in this case. And I'm going to then assign a BPM pulse to the x-axis in this case. And maybe set its interval every 4. So, that's another way to do it.
And then the interval offset on one of these, interval offset, you could set them to the same interval, but set them off from one another. Is that right?
Yep. So if we go to the fixed constraint 2, we can have it, instead of starting always at the 0th interval, we can go at 1, and so now we can kind of create, it happens on this kind of offbeat.
Imagine that you do them at the same interval. They're all at interval 1.
Well,
but oh no.
Yeah, you'd want to like
the interval 3.
Yeah,
4.
it's 0 through 1 minus the interval is what you're offsetting.
Perfect. Yeah. So do one at interval 1, one at interval 2, one at interval 3, and make them all interval 4.
Yep.
I mean, sorry, offset.
Yep. So that will be 0. This will be 1, and this will be 2. So we get this kind of 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1.
It looks much more like a
robotic. A little bit.
yeah, kind of like what's it looking in Present?
Let's go back.
That's kind of awesome.
Time of day here. Let's see a little bit more. Off the fog.
It's kind of cool. It's like a cluster itself is trying to dance.
All right. Well, that's it.
Cool.
Thanks for watching. See you next time.